Chapter 14. The Brain Cushion. A cozy rev mirror, Russian Zerkalo Kozyreva, Romanized Zerkalo Kozyreva, in Russian esoteric literature from 1990s, is a device made from long sheets of aluminum, sometimes from glass or reflecting mirror-like material, curled into a cylindrical spiral. It is alleged to focus different types of radiation, including that coming from biological objects, when those objects are placed inside of it. Cozy Rev mirrors were used in experiments related to extrasensory perception, or ESP, conducted in the Institute of Experimental Medicine of Siberia, division of the Russian Academy of Sciences. That's from Wikipedia on May 15th, 2023. Yeah, I quoted Wikipedia, but I said it was from Wikipedia, so if you don't like it, do your own stuff. The horror was like a soup, a violet soup in the half-light of the cylinder's mirrored insides. What illumination there was had the character of a black light, and it seemed to transmit fear as a radio tower does. Ethan felt it on him, emanating from those endless dark eyes. They were grays like any space movie, but not like any space movie. They had little faces, little noses, tight little mouths, great bald heads, scrawny, wrinkly bodies colored gray like putty, and they were naked, but with no characteristics that indicated male or female. Where were the suits of gray the Guardian had spoken of? Ethan saw the eyes of black, but he didn't see any clothes, let alone any sort of futuristic suit. Did the Guardian mean their bodies? Birds, cats, and other animals make themselves bigger in order to discourage predators. A similar phenomenon was at play here. All the black-eyed things above were moving almost in sequence, as though they sang a round. Waves of movement reflected the moves of those nearest and followed through the rest of them all the way beyond where the eye could see. As every visible surface was mirrored, it was impossible to tell precisely where they were or how many of them actually filled the ship. They were projecting thoughts at him. Ethan realized this when in his mind inexplicable ideas began to bubble up, a type like he had seen in the vision. It was somewhat paralyzing, and his throat tightened as his breath came faster. Then suddenly they disappeared as though they had been wiped away. "Follow me," he heard. This thought was not one cloaked in fear. If the fearful thoughts were indigo, this was gold. Ethan closed his eyes, said, "Big yipe, snow cap," then opened them and turned to the stairs. The Guardian told him that he must fight one, and he should not fear them, and they could not hurt him. It was like a code protocol in software. Certain email servers had attachment filtration that would send questionable files into a safe area where they would be inspected to determine if any viruses hid in them. If those files executed in that area and had a virus, only that area would be affected, and it would be wiped without having to harm the rest of the system. "I'm a safe area," Ethan murmured, and looked at the reflective stairs. "You can't get in." The spiral steps reaching high into the vessel had no seam. It was as though their collective reflective completeness grew from the ship itself. They were the same odd metal. Up one floor, and Ethan saw another area like that below. It was a circular central room, and because of the memory of the dacha Ethan had, he knew there were 5 rooms in circumference around that primary area. He wondered how many people were in each, if it were 3 like the space in which he'd awakened, or if different practices defined different rooms. He tried to occupy his mind with such thoughts. If he looked up again, the fear would hit him. He refused to look up. He refused to see those endless obsidian eyes. Ethan looked up. They were still there, all right, but thankfully seemed as far away as before. His heart began to beat as he began to consider the possibility that they were an illusion. Maybe it was all automated. Maybe there was something else at play here. Maybe that's why the Guardian told him to try and fight one. Maybe there was only one, and he was being reflected by these mirrors, and that made him look like he was his own army. Ethan grit his teeth and continued to the next level. It was a copy of the last one, and likewise empty of anything but hidden doors he knew led to a circular arrangement of rooms. His curiosity and fear caused him to glance up again. This time what seemed to be an entire group of greys had not moved, but their menacing bobbing and weaving motion did not seem further away. They were getting closer, maybe 2 more levels, and he'd be in their midst. His heart pounded, but he stared at the steps and continued to climb. The hiss came louder, and the waves of terror thicker. He could feel it on his neck, as though at any moment needles would rip into him, cold needles of fiery acid. It was one of those thoughts they were pushing at him. But he had the firewall, he had the protection. There was a high-pitched squeal getting louder and louder like a fire alarm. It was grating, scratching at his mind. And now there were nails on chalkboards and sick, wet noises and higher screeching. The imagery got darker and more putrid. Ethan had to focus his mind like a laser. He had to focus not on the difficult journey described by the metaphorical treasure map, but on the gold at the end. The gold at the end. Even so, he incidentally looked up once more. Inches from his face, with the eyes the size of grapefruits, and darker than death in a gray sack of skull boasting a slitted nose and sharp little teeth around a tongueless mouth, a being of putrefaction hissed pure evil at him. In determined terror, Ethan screamed back. There was indeed a horde right in front of him. It was not one being reflected infinitely. It was many, many beings compounding their own reflection. They were ahead of him, so thick they blocked the next level like a carpet of ants fording a river. A deep and high voice answered him in a collective screech of chaotic nonsense and cacophony. Ethan kept screaming back, waiting for them to come at him. But they wouldn't. They ratcheted up the noise. They effervesced fear like a pheromone. They even blocked out half the blue-black light of the reflective space with their very number, and their cloud of terror seemed to close in on Ethan. It was enwrapping him, and he was running out of breath. At last, the monstrous insanity of the situation struck a new emotional chord in him. He had been screaming in fear and reciprocity and confusion. Was it doing any good? This predicament was not his fault, not entirely. The punishment for curiosity did not match the crime, and what right had these damn things, whatever they were, be they alien or demon, to invade his mind and push their malevolent doctrines? Then there was the rage at the loss of his situation on the West Coast, the sort of reset his life had been forced into, and the difficulty of living generally in 2021, and the embarrassment of being tricked by a woman's attention, and the fear that this all had happened, and the fear that this is all that had happened between he and the woman, and the hope that it was not, that he had a real connection with Chloe, who was really Claire. And all these things, they were enough. Ethan balled up one of his hands into a fist as the darkness was nearly complete around him. He struck out as hard as he could. It was a bit like hitting a cardboard box, but weaker. His fist went right through the face of the thing so fast, its skin followed, and a putrid green slime in spherical form appeared suddenly, falling straight down the center of the spiral stairs to the very bottom of the cylinder like a stone dropped in a well. It splattered there, and some of it apparently hit unconscious Buford as Ethan heard a echoing grunt follow after up the cylinder. Then the whole ship shivered as it had before. The screeching, hissing terror became even more intense. But when Ethan turned his head back to the horde, like a synchronized school of wicked E.T. fish, they flinched. Ethan took another step upward, facing them all the time, neck craned, arms out. So, they were no singular creature, infinitely reflected, but the horde as they seemed. Yet they were somehow powerless. At his advance, they jerked back, and he realized they were standing at the next level in circumference of the stairs, leaning over the mirrored railing as a horde. As he came up, several of them lost grip and fell, bouncing once or twice, but not breaking open like a ripe melon as Ethan had expected. Well, you had to punch a cardboard box, didn't you? On whim, he swung at the nearest one, and it popped like the other. This time, Ethan noticed the skin of it was like a pricked water balloon, but slimy instead of rubbery, and even as he looked at it, it seemed to be dissolving away. He flicked it off in disgust. Now I get why Malkuthel called it a suit. Continued the demon screech. Shut up! Ethan howled. And this time he reached for one and grabbed it, stepping off the stair onto whatever floor he had made it to within the cylinder. They parted like the gray demon sea, and the one Ethan grabbed by the arm grabbed him back, and it tried to bite his hand. He didn't quite know what to do, so he spun the other direction with the thing, successfully guessing centrifugal force would pull its head back. What he hadn't realized was that this action would cause the creature on his arm to act as a bludgeon for his fellows, knocking 2 or 3 into slime before itself imploding into goo and skin stuff that Ethan flicked off. Now the palpable fear started to be, it was weird, it started to be funny. They were just a frog blowing itself up and squealing. At their worst, they were harmless? What? What was going on here? Ethan pretended to advance on them, and they flinched, and they squealed and backed up the stairs, and then he came after them as fast as he could, prompting them to turn and retreat. The squeal got louder, the sound got higher and meaner, and whenever he could reach one, he snatched it and swung it around until its luminescent, gooey insides exploded out, became a sphere, and fell below. They always fell below, or rather behind. It was almost like metal getting sucked toward a magnet, and the goo retained its spherical shape, and would sometimes move a little on its own, rolling into the hole at the center of the stairs or down the reflective stairs themselves. It was like a greasy hologram, a greasy laser dot without a source that could float in midair if it chose. That was the character of whatever was inside these things. Some part of Ethan's mind wondered if this were the spiritual expression of the beings, but he was too concentrated on the now to follow the idea. The stairs were many, and so were the gray creatures with their green jelly center. There were hundreds of them, thousands maybe. They couldn't get away fast, but they managed to stay just ahead of him, ever retreating. Ethan would get tired before they would get too close. Looking down, he saw that he had come such a distance, the bottom of the cylinder was invisible. He continued to climb, and abruptly they couldn't retreat from him. They just pressed into themselves, doing so with enough force they definitely burst a few of their own number. Ethan burst more. He would grab them and swing them into one another and force his fists into them, and they would squeal and writhe and explode, but somehow the goo didn't make him wet. He could feel it. It was cold and slimy, rather like the white of an egg, and it had a similar sulfuric odor, but it did not stick to him. It retained solidity, spirited itself away, then retreated below and behind. Ethan kept pushing. They managed to scramble as one, leaving very few behind except those that popped or fell down the void amid the spiral of the stair. Now something else happened. Ethan noticed the ship was in a continual shudder. It was shaking enough that his steps were half unsteady, and the odd demon alien thing would fall out from the rest tumbling down. Ethan felt himself floating at intervals. Sometimes something was influencing the ship, something related to the destruction of these creatures, like they were pushing thoughts into his head. Did this have something to do with how the ship operated? Was there a true collective here? Was Ethan destroying individual servers of an organic cloud that was a very real neural network? The ship bucked, throwing Ethan up the spiral stairs. Because they corkscrewed with no central pillar around which they spiraled, this sent Ethan right into the ant-mat bodies of the retreating horde. He crashed through several dozen of them, actually becoming disoriented in the screaming, exploding, writhing, fear-soaked nest. They felt like fish did and panicked just the same, moving in terror away as fast as they could go. They went. But then the gravitational axis of the ship shifted again, and Ethan felt himself falling. He grabbed a railing and managed to loop his legs around it before he plummeted down the central cavity. The void was only about 6 feet across total, but that was enough to be lethal if he fell right. What blew Ethan's mind was that somehow this didn't scare him at all. In the back of his mind, he knew falling all that way was the real danger now. So as he continued his upward ascent, having lost scant ground, he now gripped the railing with one hand. Still, this did not cause the fight or flight response. The trilling thrill of falling, the instinctual fear that should have come, it was gone. Facing this horde was actually, it was in a sense resetting his mind. He was transitioning into a renewed sort of thinking, a new Ethan. He was starting to feel a bit exhilarated, but not without some small degree of fatigue. Ethan was sweating and breathing heavy now. Without warning, he heard a bellow as from a monstrous beast. Looking down over the railing, he saw something that glowed emerald and was getting brighter all the way at the bottom, a pinprick, and yet more. Now it was growing to a dot and reflecting all the way up through the cylinder like emerald fire. Ethan grit his teeth with determination and turned back to the horde retreating above. "I cannot go back the way I came!" he yelled. The ship turned, and he felt himself sailing through the air, right into one of the walls at the outside of a level around the stairs. Abruptly, the wall opened, and he fell through, barely managing to grab what was now the edge of a doorway with one arm. Ethan saw that he was in a room with dreamers on the slab, like he had been when he awoke. Only he noticed something wrong. They had tumors. Gray, rubbery tumors bubbling out of them like elephant flesh, expanding out of the tubes and other biotech growing from their heads. A shock of horror went through Ethan to see human beings in such a state, but he had little time to appreciate the emotion. The ship shifted again, and he was falling back the way he had come. He managed to stumble run to the railing, grab a hold, and continue his spotty ascent up the stairs. Green dripped down. Another titanic shift threw him through another door, a floor up on the opposite side of the cylinder. He came at it face first, watching the doors crinkle like organic liquid drapes of mirrored metal bleeding into the walls. He barely managed to angle himself around so he could break his fall on the far wall. He did it by leaning into a roll when he landed. The impact was a jolt that rattled him. He shook his head for an instant, taking a second to register what he saw. Things came into focus. Here the gray bubbles had taken on the form of the little pygmy creatures Ethan was presently contending with, but they were incomplete, like a chick right before it breaks out of the egg. These things, they were being grown from people, like mold on old meat or something. If they were indeed a suit, as Malkuthel said, it was as though the people unconscious on those slabs were... It was as though they were being farmed. And they seemed to be going through a progression as Ethan climbed the cylinder, as though the vessel were involved in some macro process. The ship began to tilt again. Ethan ran to the stairs and practically leapt up them, arms swinging. The ship shuddered again, and he grabbed a rail. Ethan's legs swung out, and now he was falling onto the horde up the cavity in the ship's center. He pinwheeled his arms and legs and screamed and beat at them, and the cloud of green swirled in his wake. But once again, orientation began to shift, so he reached out and barely managed to grab another rail, the fingers of one hand slipping off just as he managed to bring the other around. Looking up or forward, now Ethan thought he could detect the source of the light, or at least some sort of black light that was brighter than the illumination behind, an illumination that simply seemed to exist amidst the endless reflections. It was hard to determine any source. Ethan looked down again. The green pinprick was much brighter, and he could detect luminous undulations amidst its form, as though it were one very large version of all the spirit globs he had knocked out of the demon horde. Whatever he had to do, he couldn't wait around where he was. Ethan pressed on, and the amount of time that had passed is hard to reckon, though it was time passing in the real world, not the world between worlds. This Ethan was sure of. The size of the ship's insides had a variable quality in terms of dimensional solidity. It was swift timelessness for Ethan, and though the roars behind grew louder, and his side ached with the effort of the climb, and his breath came fast and raspy, he continued on, finally reaching the last floor at the top. There was an enclosed end to the spiral staircase, occluding what was beyond, a rectangular cube of violet light. One plane of the violet cube was open and had a wide arc-shaped doorway. Emerging from it, behind maybe 24 more of the wicked gray things, Ethan immediately busied himself with their ectoplasmic reduction, finally finding the last one and ripping it in two. All the goo retreated back to the enclosed staircase under the glowing violet cube. When Ethan looked to the roof of that wide rectangular enclosure above the spiral stair, he saw a sort of cushion with one of the gray creatures spread across it. Its little arms and legs were at their fullest extent on either side, but they were so recessed in the cushion they almost looked to be a part of it, except for their grayness against the cushion's metallic hue. The thing's black eyes stared at the roof, razor-toothed mouth open, jaw slack. The thought struck Ethan that this creature was mentally networked in with the rest somehow, and that might explain part of the ship's wild shifts in gravity. They were trying to shake him off, or maybe smash him within the vessel's innards. It was clear to Ethan these things used fear to protect themselves. Intense fear that set one to tremble, but fear that was really an illusion. They were weak. They would need other weapons than their own hands could wield to subdue any assailants. Ethan followed the gaze of the remaining black-eyed skin sack to the top of this final area, expecting a great mirror but seeing something else. The roof was a dome, and as Ethan stared, he had the curious impression of being sucked skyward, but into a charcoal abyss of strange silhouetted violet. It was the ocean, and the violet color was some sort of bioluminescence that wrapped the ship like a glove, extending out into the darkness. And what darkness it was, but they were near the ocean's murky bottom and rushing over its uneven, muddy floor. The vessel was moving this way and that to avoid outcroppings of rock and obstacles that appeared to be somehow structural in certain places. Cities made of coral. As the vessel would move, the final little gray creature on the flat cushion atop the covering of the stairs would twitch. The base levels were the back of the ship. The roof was the front. The creature doubtless felt he was moving forward. It was moving forward through the deep. But in reality, it was stationary. Yet Ethan was sure whatever it was doing moved the ship. The cushion was part of it. Without further hesitation, he pulled himself up the enclosure onto the cushion and grabbed the creature's ankle. He had to pull hard to free the thing from the clutches of the silvery membrane of the cushion, but he managed it, and the miscreant writhed as he swung it like a sack of trash into the squarish side of the boxy stair enclosure. The creature hissed and exploded into green shrieks satisfactorily. The ship trembled and abruptly began to drift through the obsidian deep. With an unexpected suddenness, all the high-pitched terror screams were gone. Ethan blinked several times, then looked to the silvery cushion atop the enclosure and maneuvered himself fully onto its strange membranous surface. He laid out and spread his arms and legs as he had seen the little alien thing do, looking into the translucent dome that was the front of the cylinder. He felt something electric and immediately realized he was moving the ship. "Yeah, boy!" Ethan yelled, and a thrill washed over him that made him laugh like a kid on Christmas. When he squinted, the lights grew brighter in the water, and when he tried to push his chest forward, it seemed the vessel went faster. If he leaned, it leaned. If he looked up, it went up, and he felt himself sliding. Whatever gravity was in this thing, he was influencing it somehow. If he went down, the same thing happened. The cushion was a bit small for him, and his arms and legs actually overhung it by a few inches, though they were still atop the singular metal cube over the deep circular cavity in the center of the mirrored spiral. Those creatures couldn't have been taller than 5 feet. Most were smaller, so light, so small. So the green slime was the real creature? Ethan recalled that as the green left, the deflated skin would effervesce away, similar to cotton candy under a faucet. There was some sort of techno-spiritual relationship at play here. He couldn't understand it. It involved the cushion, the ship, deep emotions like thrills and terror, everything. A high-pitched whine somewhere came as he aimed the craft at a quadrant of water that wasn't as black as the rest. He knew he was moving fast, but it wasn't fast enough for Ethan's liking. It was like he had been somehow sucked into the ship's infrastructure, and it was in a panic. He noticed the shivering was back, but it was not coming from him. He wondered if perhaps there were pressures in the sea that he was tempting by an over-hasty ascent. But were physics the same in here? The gravity sure wasn't. The whine got louder, and Ethan realized it wasn't coming from the ship. It was coming from beneath him. Looking to his left, he perceived a green glow emanating out of the exit to the spiral stairs. The glow that had been the pinprick. He also noticed, as he did so, that the cushion had begun to wrap itself around his arm like goop or silk putty or some other non-Newtonian fluid. It was stiff when you interacted with it forcefully, but touch it gently and you would sink in. With considerable effort, Ethan sat forward, swung his legs over the front of the cubicle platform, and dropped the 4 or 5 feet to the ground. In so doing, he noticed for the first time an additional curved staircase on the far side of said central platform. It was reflective, so it blended right in with everything else, but for the violet cube atop the stairs and the translucent top of the cylinder, everything was silvery reflection. His attention returned to the exit of the spiral from one side of the purple cube, that plane with the doorway of archical design to... It must be the control room, yes? Malkuthal had called it the mind of the vessel. Brighter shined the deep green glow, louder came the squeals, and Ethan felt himself slipping, soon realizing that the ship in the middle of the depths of the ocean had begun to drift with no one at the helm. The hissing squeal got louder. Now Ethan could hear deeper sounds coming with it, even as he began to slide toward the curving wall of the control room, toward the dome, which was either a window or some technological projection allowing navigation. A massive white shape moved quickly into view, a sperm whale, it looked like. There was a thump, like when you hit a rabbit with a car. That was it. The cylinder hit a whale, and there was a thump. Man, this thing is huge, Ethan breathed. The ship was still deep, but the violet glow must have illuminated the premises for 100 feet around them outside the vessel. Even so, the whine behind got louder until it became a roar. The ship was now completely inverted, facing down. But they had gotten far enough from the bottom of the sea, Ethan could no longer make out any details beyond hazy black, punctuated in sea debris. An endless dark abyss fell away beneath his feet. He had allowed himself to follow the gravitational turn. He was standing at the bottom of the dome. If he paid attention, he could handle the gravitational alteration. He didn't know why the orientation was changing now. He did suspect he had something to do with it. Without further preamble, a thundering crash announced the presence of whatever made the high-pitched wailing sound. The maker of that sound had apparently fallen as the ship's gravitational orientation changed, impacting the roof of the domed violet enclosure atop the cubicle violet enclosure atop the stairs. Green slime spilled out the exit in a globular protoplasm like the white around a raw egg. It came out, sucked back in, and was replaced by spindly fingers, limbed in verdant emerald. Then a black-eyed, bald human head appeared, a humanoid, standing on the roof of the cylindrical staircase, looking down at the dome-turned bowl through the stair's inverted exit. It was Buford. Buford was covered in putrid green. It was all about him. He was a point in the center of it. And Ethan could tell immediately that it was not Buford who conducted himself, but the slime using Buford as a vehicle. The voice which came from Buford was his own, and 1,000 more. Thief in the broke world! Thief in the building place! Fool in 'em all! It was a screech. It was an accusation. And it was not remotely human. You ain't had enough yet, fam? Ethan yelled back from where he stood atop the dome. Buford responded with a shriek and jumped at him. Ethan squared his feet on the dome and yelled in response, balling his hands into fists. Buford landed squarely on him, sucking him into the green gel-like substance of the demon things. The weight of the older man with eyes of black was much greater than Ethan. The green protoplasm was fear incarnate and immediately seeped into Ethan's brain like cold fingers of death, just as the very real pale phalanges of Buford wrapped around Ethan's throat and squeezed. That probably would have been it for him. But the ship's underwater attitude continued to follow a swift end-over-end arc in the wake of its pilot loss. Interior gravitation followed suit. This caused gravitational pull to gradually shift again. Both Buford and Ethan came sliding down the dome of the room and began to tumble until both impacted an obtrusive corner atop the violet cubic stair enclosure. This dug right into the back of Buford, likely collapsing a lung. It was luck or providence that Ethan ended up on top. Either way, it caused Buford to lose his grip as he exhaled percussively and belched bloody foam. Ethan rolled to the side and landed on the featureless metallic floor. Buford tumbled off the corner that skewered him, barely managing to land, stunned. He was still surrounded in demonic green protoplasm. The man wasn't done. His black eyes burrowed into Ethan. You hate all things so deep you refuse our truest apotheosis of your wasted mortal soul. No, Cap, I don't even know what you're saying. Be one, Ethan. You'll find your little lady. You'll have the sex-thick dance and live in tantric pleasure on the cusp of falling down, riding thrills into riches forevermore. Buford leaped at him. Ethan dodged out of the way in the nick of time. The ship was starting to lean again. He felt the fear threatening him, but he remembered now that he was immune to it, and that meant he was immune to fatigue, and none of this was real anyway, was it? It had to be a dream. And if it was a dream, and he was dreaming, in God mode, he could dominate this creature. And so Ethan yelled out, sidestepping with his arms wide as he did, "The Guardian said Buford still had a chance!" Rah! It looked like the man's jaw was double long and unhinged as Buford ran at Ethan. The vessel was still spinning and hadn't totally switched over yet. Ethan had an idea. He was uphill from Buford. When the man-thing came, he faked him out, pretending to run one way and going another. He then skipped up the small stairs to the cushion, leaned into it, and felt the ship's electricity. Buford had about-faced quick, but had to work against his own momentum. Ethan grit his teeth and leaned into the particular mental intention he had before when he knew his mind moved the ship. The vessel's attitude changed robustly, and green slime Buford was luminously cast against the far wall. Ethan heard the wind get knocked out of him as the gel-like substance flayed out similar to a pancake. It didn't have any physical mass. It was illusion. There was something there, but it wasn't anything Ethan had encountered before. It wasn't gas and it wasn't water. Buford hit that wall at full speed. Ethan even heard his head slam into it hard enough to cause real brain damage. But the man's eyes didn't blink, and though air came from his evacuated lungs, he continued to writhe, seethe, and calibrate his murderous energies toward Ethan. Ethan wrenched the ship again, tossing Buford the other direction into the further wall. This time he hit it headfirst and slid down, lying on the ground, twitching. The green gobs around him began to wane in brightness. Ethan returned the ship's orientation to its gravitational vertical. It took him some effort to pull himself from the non-Newtonian cushion. He hopped down and made his way to Buford. The green kept away, bubbling away, hissing away, evaporating away. Where it went, Ethan did not know. Buford was trembling. His eyes were clear. They were now blue, and there were tears in them. He quivered as he looked at Ethan. Ethan didn't know what to say, but he could tell the hold of the things had been broken. "Buford, you're free." Buford shook, and he blinked, and he stuttered in an accent that sounded like it was over 100 years old. Y'all think this old carpetbagger got a chance? Lord, fix his soul." He could barely breathe. "Busted up." "The angel said you had a chance, Buford. That's all I know." "Hey, angel said that." "It did." "Well, dog my cats." And the light left his eyes. In an instant, the man's body began to shrivel up until all moisture left, and it became dry and cracked and imploded in powder, transforming to a pile roughly the shape of a human on the floor. All that was left were what the man had been wearing: shoes, jeans, a flannel shirt, a hat, and the dust about those things. Ethan shuddered, feeling a mixture of sadness, hope, and relief. Maybe Buford had that conversion experience. Ethan remembered some story about a thief on a cross, but hopefully the danger, for the moment, whatever it was, wherever it came from, was gone. This was relieving. It gave him hope of seeing a true light at the end of the tunnel. Ethan didn't really know his Bible. As much as Christianity had entered into the pop culture zeitgeist of his generation, Ethan was familiar with it. But as a Gen Z kid, he was a post-Christian. He knew of his country's default faith, what a Midwesterner from the 80s might understand of Buddha. The relevant bits stuck out, the rest was vague. Culture had shifted by Ethan's time, and he was part of a new wave blind to the realities making up his own homeland. He had been born in the late 90s, after all. Ethan didn't have any idea how true spirituality worked. He was glad Buford could no longer harm him, sad he had died, and slightly nauseated at how he had become dust. That phrase, dog my cats, where had he heard that before? He walked back to the cushion, the control cushion, and he was about to lay down, feet dangling over the edge of the spiral stair enclosure. His intention was to return to Carl and rescue Chloe. That's when the thought struck him. Wasn't he back home in the real world again? Ethan leaned into the cushion and pushed the ship toward the top of the sea until it breached like a missile the size of a building into the night, glowing violet and startling the blue bejesus out of several Filipino fishermen a quarter-mile away. Ethan could see their faces in the dark as he ascended above the wave. The dome had zoomed in for him, focusing exactly on what his mind was curious about. In a nutshell, where he could see, he could go, or he could examine. When he lay into the cushion, the ship was like an amplifier for his own senses, binoculars for the mind. The Filipinos were hilariously terrified, and though he empathized, he couldn't stifle an impish laugh. He felt the cushion adhering to him more and more intimately. I could stay, he thought. I could go somewhere, put all this behind me, maybe even make a fortune. That's when he remembered where dog my cats came from. It was Huckleberry Finn. That was slang characters used all up and down the Mississippi in that book. No wonder Buford sounded antiquated. No wonder he was named Buford. No wonder he disintegrated. The man was over 100 years old. Somehow, whatever was going on here directly affected physics. It forestalled the aging process. This chilled Ethan and was part of the motivation that ultimately decided him. Buford had light in his eyes, gold light, for the briefest of instants before he was gone. If he could escape from a veritable slime cloud of the things, certainly Chloe. And if Ethan helped her escape, wouldn't she be grateful? Even if she was an evil agent like Buford, she wasn't as far along as he was she? It seemed as though there was some sort of saturation threshold at play. Surely, after seeing the darkness, she would prefer the light. She could be shown the light. He didn't know how, but it was possible. It was possible! But her real name is Claire, Ethan breathed to himself. That's what the angel said, right? A peace came on him, and he seemed to hear the voice of the one who was God saying, yes. Ethan exhaled again. An adventurer he was not. But if she went through that vision, if she were subject to those things, was she in the real world? Had they taken her back to the real world, or kept her in the wild place, the building place, the world between worlds? If they had, she might not even be as far along as he was in their brainwashing scheme. There was hope. Hope decided him. Ethan pulled his attention from the bamboozled fisherman and violet cylinders still dripping, cast his mind on the place where Carl was. Somehow he knew this is what he had to do. As he did so, he felt everything shift. It was like every single atom in existence turned on its side at a 90-degree angle. Perhaps most disturbing of all, Ethan finally managed to fully connect with the ship. It was a mind like shapes and gears, as he had seen in the vision. It was an intelligence, one that had a personality and was in a way self-conscious. But it was a different kind of consciousness. It was above him and below him. It was subject to him, but it was deeper than him, and it had been connected to the green. Now it was connected to him. It shook and protested, and Ethan heard strange bass noises, feeling in him somehow that a mandated directive were being contravened, but knowing that any contravention of these creatures was certainly a good thing. Suddenly there was a bright golden flash. Malkuthel. The angel grabbed his hand, rescuing him from the cushion. Ethan watched, half-lidded, realizing only his fingers protruded from it, and almost his entire body had been subsumed, absorbed, integrated. He came out with a pop. Malkuthel said, "You chose right returning to this non-place. My ex-co-worker in metaphysical transportation here," he slapped the cushion harshly so it couldn't get his hand, "would have beguiled you into finding its own wicked brethren in your world after it sucked you in completely like a Venus fly trap, as was Buford's intent before you drove the demons out. This rebel mitochondria would have killed you." Malkuthel held Ethan by the wrist. They were floating. "Hold on tight." Malkuthel took them into the violet doorway atop the spiral stairs and down through their endless mirrored center. Everything was tumbling around them. Whatever gravitational axes defined the ship's interior were entirely out of balance. Then there was a very strong impact, and Ethan lost his grip on the angel's arm, falling, colliding with a flat, reflective plane, losing his wind and feeling pressed against that flat plane even as he slid around on it, and things rumbled everywhere. Suddenly, there was one more great jarring impact, and gravity changed again. Ethan felt himself slung across an empty void, the purple light flickering inside the cylinder. Malkuthel caught him by the arm, swinging his feet to the railing. They were sideways. Malkuthel moved forward, lifting Ethan. He did something to the wall of the vessel, and it exploded outward, letting in bright twilight. Malkuthel brought Ethan to the lip of his new exit, placed him there, and said, "Pull yourself out. I must go." "Okay." Ethan was increasingly fatigued, and he could feel the thick air around him, but it was making him drowsier and drowsier. Malkuthel shot into the twilight sky like lightning. With his final effort, Ethan hoisted himself up out of the hole. He was on the side of the cylinder, and as he exited its interior domain, the entire vessel did that shivering thing. Ethan felt it. Distantly, he heard a familiar voice. "Ethan! Stay where you are!" Ethan looked up. He could dimly make out the form of a graying man he knew from somewhere, rushing toward him from the shore. "Howdy, fam," he said, and slid off the cylinder into the sea.